Okay, well, it's been wonderful to have Hannah Ginsborg here giving the NYIP lectures and treating us to some very interesting and rich ideas about a very difficult topic, normativity, and in particular urging on us the thesis that normativity need not have anything to do with reasons. And today we're here for the exciting conclusion, which is titled Normativity Without Reasons in Wittgenstein's Rule Following Consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to do these. I've been enjoying it tremendously. I feel like I have to say that this lecture was very down to the wire, and the handout may be a bit rough and ready, and the talk may be a bit rough around the edges. And I was just saying to Paul that these are some of the ideas that I feel least sure about. And he said, oh, but this is the part where everything hangs on this part. And I said, oh, no, actually, I sort of thought of the second lecture as the kind of pivot, but Paul didn't think so. Anyway, we will see. Also, I feel like I should say that this lecture, I feel like it's less fun, at least than the last lecture, because you won't get any nice stories about little kids or pictures of weird-looking sofas. I'm sorry for that. You're just getting a lot of quotes from Wittgenstein and some quotes from Paul. I will start. So as before, I'm going to start with a very brief summary of where we've been so far. So these lectures as a whole aim to challenge the view that the idea of normativity is essentially connected with that of reasons. In the first lecture, I presented a preliminary argument to that effect, based on large part on considerations about how to understand the term normativity in light of its history of use. And I argued in that first lecture that many proponents of the reasons view are motivated by an unduly narrow conception of what counts as normativity proper, excluding the so-called formal normativity apparently belonging to law, etiquette, rules of games, and so on. I suggested that this restriction of what counts as normativity proper was philosophically unfortunate, and I proposed instead that we return to the traditional conception of normativity as applying to all cases in which we recognize a distinction between what is and what ought to be, even those in which the ought is relative to a rule or standard. And on this traditional conception, the reasons view is much harder, although perhaps not impossible, to defend. Then in the second lecture, I presented a more substantive argument intended to show that the reasons view is untenable, even if the notion of normativity is restricted so as to exclude merely formal normativity. This argument turned on what I call primitive normativity, a kind of normativity that doesn't depend on reasons, but which counts as genuine normativity even on the restricted conception. I introduced this idea by considering what's involved in children's early language learning and concept acquisition. Children learn to use language through imitating adults, which requires learning to categorize the situations in which adults use words and the objects that are salient in those situations. And this means coming to recognize objects and situations as belonging together or going with other objects. An 18-month-old who says doggy when she sees a dog is manifesting her recognition that the dog goes with or should be sorted with other things to which she's heard the word dog applied. This is the same kind of recognition that she manifests when, given a scrambled array of, say, dolls and boats, she manipulates them to put the dolls together in one place and the boats together in another. The recognition of normativity in these cases doesn't depend on her already having grasped that these things are dogs or dolls or boats. Rather, it's what makes possible her grasp of these concepts in the first place. And I went on to argue that the recognition of primitive normativity is also presupposed in adults' use of language. We understand a word like doll to the extent that we have the capacity to recognize novel uses of doll as conforming or not conforming to earlier uses, which is a matter of recognizing whether newly presented objects, for example, an artist's mannequin, do or don't belong with objects that we previously identified as dolls, such as Barbie dolls or dolls in a doll's house. I argued that the normativity that figures in our judgments about whether an artist's mannequin should be counted as a doll isn't relative to a rule, and so it's not formal normativity. But I also argued that, by the same token, it's not grounded in reasons either. In this lecture, I want to connect these considerations, the ones I was just describing, I want to connect these considerations to the discussion of rule following in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. And I'll argue in particular that Wittgenstein's view of what it is to follow a rule incorporates the idea of primitive normativity, and more generally, of normativity without reasons. My aim here is twofold. First, showing how the idea of primitive normativity figures in Wittgenstein's remarks on rule following will, I hope, help make that idea clearer. And second, although I've defended the idea of primitive normativity on the grounds that we have to recognize it as a condition of understanding expressions and of grasping concepts, it might still be objected that the idea of primitive normativity, or of normativity without reasons, has no application in reality. That is, it might be argued that there can be no correct way of sorting a newly presented object or of using an expression in a novel situation, unless we can appeal either to an antecedently specified rule or to a reason in terms of which our way of sorting the object can be justified. Perhaps this implies that there is also no such thing as understanding expressions or grasping concepts. But in that case, we might conclude, so much the worse for grasp of meanings or concepts. Seeing the notion of primitive normativity in the context of Wittgenstein will, I hope, help us both formulate this objection and see how it might be answered. So turning to section 2, Wittgenstein's skeptical problem about rule following. I turn now to Wittgenstein. In a famous passage in section 185 of Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein offers an example that seems to call into question the possibility of following rules. The example is of a pupil who's being taught to develop simple arithmetical series in response to commands like add 1 and add 2. So for example, when he's given the command add 1, he's to develop the series beginning 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and when given the command add 2, he's to develop the series beginning 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. This pupil seems to have caught on to the series beginning 0, 2, 4, 6, 8 because he can successfully write out segments of the series up to 1000. But now, when we ask him to continue the series after 1000, he writes 1004, 1008, 1012. Our attempts to correct him are unsuccessful. He insists that he's doing the right thing, given the examples we showed him, and he insists that he's continuing the series in the same way he did before. Wittgenstein comments that in this case, we might say that the pupil naturally understands our order, once given our explanations, as we would understand the order add 2 up to 1000, 4 up to 2000, 6 up to 3000, and so on. This example is often understood as raising a problem about how rule following is possible. For what it seems to show is that there are any number of general rules that the sequence of even numbers up to 1000 might be interpreted as exemplifying. And that in turn seems to show that there are any number of continuations of the sequence that might be interpreted as the correct continuation. In fact, any continuation might be taken as correct given a suitable interpretation of the sequence. Without a way of determining which rule the sequence is intended to exemplify, whether, for example, it's the rule to add 2, or the rule that the pupil appears to be following, there seems to be no such thing as continuing the sequence correctly. But then when we try to specify which sequence we have in mind, we run into a regress. As Wittgenstein points out in the following section, we might try to specify the rule by saying that we intend the pupil to write the next but one number after every number that he wrote. And we might think that the specification is sufficient to determine that he must say 1002 after 1000. But here we're assuming that it's clear what we mean by the word. Here we're assuming that it's clear what we mean by the words in that specification. For example, that it's clear what we mean by the word every, or for that matter, that it's clear what we mean by the word next. And such expressions can be taught only by giving examples, and these examples are also open. to multiple interpretations. So we end up with a regress problem. And the problem arises not just for making ourselves understood to the pupil, but also for making us understood to ourselves. It's not clear how we ourselves know, for example, how to interpret the finite sequences of numbers that we've so far associated with expressions like add to or even natural number. The upshot is that it appears to be completely indeterminate what counts as the correct way of going on from a sequence. But this now calls into question the possibility of following a rule. For what we do when we follow an instruction like add to or add the next but one number after each number you wrote seems to be a paradigm of rule following. And if anything can be made out to be correct in response to such an instruction, then it looks as though there can be no such thing as following a rule. So how does Wittgenstein propose to address this problem? Well, in section 202, he suggests that the problem arises from what he calls a misunderstanding. He suggests that we avoid the problem by recognizing that, as he puts it, there is a way of grasping a rule that is not an interpretation, but which, from case to case of application, is exhibited in what we call following the rule and going against it. As I read Wittgenstein, the misunderstanding is to suppose that we need to put an interpretation on, say, the sequence 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, ... up to 1000, in order to know the correct way to continue it. We mistakenly think that, unless it's specified that the sequence exemplifies the rule to add 2, or the formula y equals 2n, then it remains indeterminate what the correct continuation is. We think then that, for someone who continues the sequence correctly, going on to write 1002 counts as following a rule only if that person has already come to understand a formula like y equals 2n, or an instruction like add 2, and that they now recognize 1002 as the correct application of the formula, or the correct response to the instruction. But this overlooks the possibility of our simply recognizing, without having put any interpretation on the sequence, that 1002 is the correct continuation. In the terms that I introduced in the previous lecture, we can recognize that writing 1002 is the primitively appropriate thing to do in that context. Just as the child engaged in spontaneous sorting can recognize that the doll goes with the other dolls, or that her use of the word doll fits previous uses of that word, so we can recognize that writing 1002 after 1000 fits what we've previously done in developing the sequence. For example, that it fits with our having written 12 after 10, or 102 after 100. Knowing how to continue the sequence, that is, being able to recognize at each step which is the correct continuation, is in Wittgenstein's terms, a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation. And once we've understood that, Wittgenstein thinks, we're in a position to say that one way of continuing the sequence is correct simplicator, and others incorrect simplicator, even though different continuations may be correct relative to this or that interpretation. So section 3, I'm going to talk about the idea of going on. To understand better Wittgenstein's approach to the problem, and its connection with the considerations raised in the previous lecture, it will help to consider the broader context in which Wittgenstein presents the case of the aberrant pupil. The case is part of a narrative which begins earlier in the investigations at section 143, with a pupil who's being taught to write numbers in decimal notation. Wittgenstein describes our teaching him to copy sequences of numerals, 0 through 9, and then to write out sequences of natural numbers into the tens and hundreds. That's in section 145. The teaching seems to proceed by giving examples rather than verbal explanations. The pupil initially learns by having his hand guided and then copying what the teacher writes. And for getting the child to continue the sequence for numbers 10 and above, that is, for getting the child to get the idea of the decimal system, the teacher, quote from Wittgenstein, the teacher uses particular emphases, underlines figures, writes them one under another, and so on. After a long interpolation about reading, section 185 picks up the narrative at the point it was left at section 145 by describing our teaching the pupil to write out sequences in response to commands like add to. It seems clear from the narrative that this is the pupil's first exposure to arithmetical expressions like add or the plus sign, so that he doesn't understand expressions like add to at the outset. In particular, he doesn't have the concept of addition in general, and so he's not yet in a position to grasp equations like 1,000 plus 2 equals 1,002. In fact, there's no reason to think that he's familiar with the equals sign or the idea of arithmetical equality at all. Rather, it seems, teaching him to continue the sequence of even numbers as a response to the instruction add to is a way of getting him first to understand the expression add to, perhaps as a precursor to understanding words like add and other arithmetical expressions more generally. Now, I'm emphasizing this because it's important not to think of the pupil, or indeed of any child engaged in this exercise, as writing each number as the result of a calculation or as the outcome of reasoning. Suppose for the moment that we're dealing with a normal child who goes on as we expect to write 1,002 after 1,000, and who, like the aberrant pupil, is confident that she's doing as she ought. Her confidence can't rest on her having reasoned, for example, that she should write 1,002 because she's supposed to add 2 to the last number she wrote, and because 2 added to 1,000 makes 1,002. For she doesn't yet grasp the concepts she needs to engage in this reasoning. The point of the exercise is precisely to make these concepts available to her. To help fill out the picture, we should also note that the exercises Wittgenstein describes in these sections, exercises of copying numerals and continuing numerical sequences, are part of a broader range of activities that he describes simply as cases of going on. These activities often figure in Wittgenstein's discussions of what it is to learn a rule or to learn the meaning of an expression. Consider this passage from 208 of the Investigations, in which Wittgenstein is explaining how children come to grasp concepts relevant to the idea of rule following. How do I explain the meaning of regular, uniform, same to anyone? To someone who, say, speaks only French, I will explain these words by means of the corresponding French words. For someone who has not yet got these concepts, I will teach him to use the words by means of examples and by means of exercises. So in this teaching, I will show him the same colors, the same lengths, the same shapes. I will have him find them and produce them, and so on. I will teach him, say, to continue ornamental series uniformly when told to do so. And this is just a parenthesis for me. An ornamental series is a continuous repeating pattern of the kind that you might find on an ancient frieze. And in addition, to continue progressions. That is, for example, when given 1 dot, 2 dot, 3 dots, to go on with 4 dots, 5 dots, and 6 dots. Here Wittgenstein is describing exercises we might use to get a pupil to grasp the meaning of words like regular and same, but they might also be used to teach children concepts of color, length, and shape. Or, as in the case of the last exercise with the dots, they might be used to help the child grasp the concept of number. Wittgenstein offers more examples of going on in a passage from Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics that begins, how does one describe the process of learning a rule? One of these examples is that of continuing a pattern that alternates dashes with pairs of dots. An even simpler example is the kind of game we might play with a baby. If A claps his hands, B is always supposed to do it too. It's even clearer in these cases that the activities don't involve application of a rule that one already grasps prior to engaging in the activities. The child continuing the sequence of a dash alternating with 2 dots doesn't draw a dash after 2 dots because, say, she's grasped the rule, alternate pairs of dots with dashes, and now recognizes that drawing a dash at this point accords with the rule. For it's only insofar as she can master that kind of activity that she's able to learn the more complex forms of going on that are required for learning concepts like alternate. or alternate, or for that matter, concepts like dot and dash. Nor does she do it because she recognizes that she should do the same as she did previously. For as Wittgenstein made clear in section 208, it's only because she can master that and a host of similar activities that she can come to grasp the concept of doing the same. Being able to carry out these kinds of activities is a precondition both for learning the concepts that correspond to the activities and for learning to grasp rules and concepts in general. Wittgenstein suggests this when he says that, although we might first teach a child to write the sequence 0 through 9 by guiding his hand, the possibility of getting him to understand, although that is also sometimes translated as the possibility of communication, this translation of Verständigung is a difficult thing, but I've gone with Anscombe's translation here, understand. The possibility of getting him to understand will depend on his going on to write it down independently. That is, the child must be able to go on from the examples we've shown him of writing the sequence, including the examples produced by our initially guiding the child's hand, if he's to arrive at the kind of understanding of the numerals that will enable him to use the decimal system. The idea is also conveyed in a passage from Zettel, where Wittgenstein describes competence in, say, continuing a series as a substratum for the meaning of explicit rules or formulae. Wittgenstein writes, I teach him to continue a series without using any expression of the law of the series. Rather, I am forming a substratum for the meaning of algebraic rules, or what is like them. Now, we might think that if a child goes on without having in mind a general rule to guide him, something corresponding to the meanings of the words add 2, or the formula y equals 2n, what he has cannot be more than a mere disposition of the kind that an animal could acquire through conditioning. More specifically, we might take the lack of an antecedently grasped rule as precluding the child's recognizing that, say, 1002 is the correct thing to write after 1000, or that the dash ought to be followed by 2 dots. In that case, we couldn't speak of a child who can continue a series or pattern as knowing how to go on, which implies that they recognize the right way to go on, but we could speak of them only as having a tendency to go on. But Wittgenstein makes clear that going on in these cases isn't just a mechanical operation, but involves the attitude that one's going on correctly. We can see this from his description of the aberrant pupil at 185 as saying, when he's challenged about why he says 1004 after 1000, he says, yes, isn't it right? I thought that's what I was supposed to do. Presumably Wittgenstein thinks that we would get the same reaction if we perversely challenged a normal child who'd written 1002. And presumably in that case, we would say that the child not only takes herself to be going on correctly, but knows that 1002 is correct in that context. A similar attitude is expressed by one of Wittgenstein's interlocutors in section 6 of Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, presumably referring to one of the activities of going on, which Wittgenstein has been describing. I know at every step what I have to do. I see it quite clearly before me. It may be boring, but there's no doubt what I have to do. The interlocutor here is confident that he's doing the right thing, that he's doing what's required of him in that context. Another relevant passage is in a section of Remarks from the Foundations of Mathematics, which in some respects parallels the case of the aberrant pupil. Wittgenstein asks, how do I know that in following the series plus 2, I must write 20,004, 20,006, and not 20,004, 20,008? And he adds, the question, how do I know that this color is red, is similar. Although Wittgenstein is here raising the possibility of skeptical doubt about whether I know how to go on in this series, the question assumes that we ordinarily think we do, just as we ordinarily think that we know how to use the word red correctly in light of previous examples of its use. In other words, the question assumes that, in writing 20,006 after 20,004 in that context, just as in applying the word red to a newly presented red object, we take ourselves to be manifesting knowledge of the right thing to say, and not just a disposition to continue a sequence in one way rather than another. Section 4, the primacy of examples. The parallel Wittgenstein draws between the question how I know that I must write 20,004, 20,006, and how I know that this color should be called red, helps bring us to the connection I want to draw between Wittgenstein's discussion of rule following and the considerations raised in the previous lecture. The connection is that Wittgenstein's idea of going on, in contexts where children are learning to understand expressions and grasp general rules, picks out essentially the same phenomenon that I described in the previous lecture when I described children's activities of imitation and categorization. Or to put the connection the other way around, we can describe the children who learn to carry out these activities as coming to know how to go on. When Piaget's one-year-old daughter Lucienne blinks her eyes in response to Piaget's blinking, she's showing that she knows how to go on from the example that Piaget has given her. She's like the child in Wittgenstein's example who's learned to clap her hands when an adult claps their hands. Or when an 18-month-old says doggy on seeing the unfamiliar dog, she is going on from previous uses of doggy in a way parallel to that in which a pupil who responds to the instruction add 2 by writing 1002 after 1000 is going on from previous uses of the expression add 2. Even the spontaneous sorting activity of spatially separating the dolls and the boats can be seen as a kind of going on, because in putting one doll beside another and then a third doll beside the first two, the child is doing the same kind of thing that an older child might do in continuing a pattern of dots and dashes. And in all these cases, both the ones I described in the previous lecture and the ones cited by Wittgenstein as illustrations of knowing how to go on, the child proceeds not merely mechanically, but purposively, with a recognition of what she's doing as fitting the examples that she's been given, or that she's given herself. In other words, her activity of going on involves the recognition of primitive normativity, and a fortiori, normativity without reasons. Now, when I introduced the idea of primitive normativity in the previous lecture, I did so by considering activities of going on in small children. And then I asked whether primitively normative attitudes might belong exclusively to a pre-linguistic developmental phase, superseded by the rule-relative or reasons-grounded normativity that we're capable of recognizing after we've acquired language. I argued that primitive normativity wasn't just a phase. Adults, too, need to possess capacities for imitation and generalization, and we need to adopt the corresponding normative attitudes as a condition of understanding words and grasping concepts. I argued the point by appealing to a certain kind of mistake that adults can make, which I call the linguistic conceptual mistake, the kind of mistake that Burge's character Bert makes when he wonders if his arthritis has spread to his thigh, or the kind of mistake that the studio visitor makes when he refers to the artist's mannequins as dolls. But we might now ask whether this is the case also for Wittgenstein's conception of going on, and more specifically of knowing how to go on. Once we've become competent language users, according to Wittgenstein, do we still need to be able to continue sequences and patterns in the same way language learners do? That is, recognizing each new step as correct, without reference to an antecedently grasped rule with respect to which it is correct? Or do we outgrow that need, so that whenever we now recognize, say, 1002 as the correct next step after 1000, we do so only because we recognize that we're following the rule to add 2, and that 1000 plus 2 is 1002. Wittgenstein's view, as I understand it, is that we do not outgrow the need for recognizing primitive normativity. This emerges from his commitment to an idea that I'll label the primacy of examples, and that I also invoked in the previous lecture when I argued that general criteria, say for something's counting as a doll or as a sofa, are always beholden to examples. We can approach this idea by considering some remarks Wittgenstein makes to the effect that when I teach someone a concept by giving them examples of the concept, I'm not conveying anything less than what I know through my own grasp of the concept. One of these remarks is at section 208, when he's talking about how we teach a child concepts like regular and uniform. As we saw, in that passage he says, I'll teach him to use the words by means of examples and by means of exercises. But before going on to describe some of the examples and exercises, for instance, continuing repetitive or progressive patterns of marks on paper, he adds, and when I do this, I do not communicate to him anything less than I know myself. Another passage is remarks from the Foundations of Mathematics, after he's given the example of continuing the pattern that alternates dashes with pairs of dots. He writes, now I ask myself, what is it that I want him to do then? The answer is, he is always to go on, as I have shown him. And what do I really mean by he is always to go on in that way? The best answer to this that I can give myself is an example like the one I have just given. And he adds, I would use this example in order to show him and also to show myself what I mean by uniform. In these passages, Wittgenstein is aiming to challenge what he thinks is a misconception about our understanding of those words whose meanings are fixed by examples rather than by definitions. The misconception is that our understanding of a word or our grasp of the corresponding concept outstrips what we know or what a child knows simply as a result of being presented, under the right circumstances, with instances of its use. We mistakenly suppose that when we use a finite number of examples to convey to someone a general concept with an infinite extension, we're giving that person something less than we ourselves possess through our grasp of the corresponding general term. But in fact, there's nothing more to our own understanding of the word or grasp of the concept than what we ourselves get from the same examples. We think that we understand the word uniform in a way that transcends the finite number of examples of uniformity we might give to teach a child the concept. But ultimately, our own understanding of the word uniform comes down to our familiarity with those examples combined with our capacity to go on from them. That is, our capacity to recognize in particular cases what does and doesn't belong with them. Now, I wanted to go on to talk about two ideas that I think are related to this from the so-called middle Wittgenstein. I decided I needed to skip that for reasons of time, but summarizing very briefly, in these passages, Wittgenstein insists that a sign like 02468 ... is just as good a sign for what we want to convey as a general expression like y equals 2n. And he doesn't just apply this to arithmetic, so there is this passage, the second passage I quote, the one from the big TypeScript. Maybe I'll just read this passage. He says, for us, games are the games we've heard of that we can enumerate, and perhaps some other ones newly formed by analogy to ours. And if perhaps someone were to write about a book about games, he wouldn't actually need the word game, not even in the title. Rather, an enumeration of the names of the individual games could serve as the title. Now, obviously, a list of games followed by ... is a far more unwieldy way of talking about games than referring to games than just using the word game. And as Wittgenstein points out in an earlier passage, such signs are much less easily remembered. But this shouldn't lead us to think that the formulations are somehow more rigorous than a list of examples. And it shouldn't lead us to forget that we understand the formulations only because we know how to go on with the examples. Anyway, moving on to the next section, the aspect of the next subsection, I should say, because I want to turn to, I've lost my copy of the handout now, the subsection in where I have this quote from Settle over the page. There we go, the section I've called Going On Without a Rule or Reason. So the aspects of Wittgenstein's view I'm emphasizing are, I think, nicely summarized in the passage from Settle that I mentioned earlier. This is the passage in which Wittgenstein remarks that someone who teaches a child to continue a series is forming a substratum for the meaning of algebraic rules, or what is like them. The passage continues as follows. I'm just going to read a few bits. He must go on like this without a reason. Not, however, because he cannot yet grasp the reason, but because in this system there is no reason. And the like this, in go on like this, is signified by a number, a value, for at this level, the expression of the rule is explained by the value, not the value by the rule. And then skipping a bit, he grasps, this is, the interlocutor says he grasps the rule intuitively, and Wittgenstein replies, but why the rule? Why not how he ought to continue? So I want to comment very briefly on these 3 points I've emphasized. So when Wittgenstein said that the child must go on like this without a reason, because in this system there is no reason, I understand Wittgenstein to be saying that when we consider the activity of going on in its role as making possible grasp of meaning or intentional content, the idea of there being reasons for going on in one way rather than another simply has no place. Now, it is true that the child, as he puts it, cannot yet grasp the reason for, say, writing 1002 after 1000. But this isn't the primary or the deepest explanation of why he must go on without a reason. The deepest explanation is that, so to speak, at the level of the substratum of meaning, reasons aren't yet in the picture. It makes sense to talk of reasons only in a context where it's already taken for granted that we have a choice of general rules to follow, so that a question can arise about which rule we're following. Now, such contexts do, in fact, arise, or they do, of course, arise. And I'm sorry I didn't put this on the handout. Maybe I'll use the board. I might, for example, write out the sequence. 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and then continue with 11, 13, 15. And it would be natural for you to ask, why did you write 11, 13, 15, and not 20, 22, 24? And at this point, I might reply, because I'm computing the series y equals x plus the sum of the digits of x. Or, from a variety of pictures of fruits and vegetables, I might pick out pictures of an orange, a carrot, a cut-up squash, an orange-colored bell pepper, and a stick of celery. And you might ask, why the celery? At this point, I might reply that it's because I'm sorting together fruits and vegetables whose names in English have 6 letters. But the fact that we can speak of reasons in these kinds of contexts doesn't mean that in every case of continuing a series or sorting objects, what I do at each step is something I do for a reason. On the contrary, it has to be possible to go on without a reason if there is to be such a thing as going on for a reason. Turning to the second point, I understand Wittgenstein's remarks about the explanatory priority of the value over the rule, that we explain what it is to add to by citing the correctness of 1002 over 1000, not vice versa, as just another expression of the point that I labeled the primacy of examples. At what Wittgenstein calls this level, the substratum level, where we're concerned with the conditions for understanding expressions, rather than taking for granted that this understanding is already in place, general rules play no explanatory role in getting someone to see how to go on in a sequence. And now to the third point, which concerns Wittgenstein's response to the interlocutor, who suggests that the child grasps the rule intuitively. Wittgenstein doesn't reply, as he might have done, by raising questions about what it means to say that we grasp a rule intuitively, or as we might now say, implicitly. Rather, he replies with the rhetorical question, but why the rule? Why not how we ought to go on? He denies, in other words, that we have to assume the existence of a general rule at all in order to make sense of the child's recognition of the correct continuation. Here I think Wittgenstein is making explicit his commitment to the possibility of primitive normativity. He allows that the child must grasp, at each step in continuing the sequence, how she ought to go on, but he denies that this requires her having grasped a rule that tells her how she ought to go on, or a reason that she can cite as justification for doing so. Turning to section 5. The last passage I quoted might give the impression that the child or adult who knows how to go on in her use of an expression does not grasp a rule. But this is not so. She does grasp a rule. But she does so in virtue of knowing how to go on with the expression, rather than knowing how to go on with the expression in virtue of grasping a rule. This is in fact essential to understanding how Wittgenstein puts his answer to the rule-following problem. The way of grasping a rule, which is not an interpretation, is precisely knowing how to go on with the expression, or knowing how to go on with the sequence. So in asking rhetorically, why the rule? Why not how he ought to go on? Wittgenstein isn't denying that the person who knows how to go on grasps a rule. The point is rather that the recognition of, say, 1002 after 1000 is the correct next step doesn't presuppose already having grasped a rule. Rather, the person's grasp of the rule, assuming that she's not already familiar with arithmetical expressions, just consists in her being able to recognize the correct next step at any point in the sequence. Moreover, just as we can say that she grasps a rule, we can also say that she follows a rule or is guided by a rule. I just wanted to mention, this relates to the question that Paul Horwich asked at the end of the last lecture about rules of grammar, whether I think of conformity to rules of grammar when we can't articulate the rule, whether I think of that as a case of following a rule. And I do think of it as a case of following a rule. The crucial thing is that we can be aware of, that we're aware if we've made a mistake, and we're aware, or can be aware, if we're doing it correctly. So there's this rule that requires that even though we have words like when we make the adjective, when we say longer, the comparative of long, we use a hard G, and similarly strong and stronger. When we make a noun out of an adjective, when we make a noun out of a verb, so we go from hang to hanger, or sing to singer, or even if we want the idea of someone who longs, that person who longs is a longer, we use a soft G. And we're aware of the correctness of what we're doing, even though we can't articulate the rule. I think this is an example that John Searle gives in Speech Acts. And I do think of that as rule following, because we basically know how to go on in the, we've heard all these examples, and we know how to go on from them in terms of where we use a soft G and where we use a hard G. But I've said that, so there is a sense in which she follows a rule or is guided by a rule, but it's crucial that we don't understand following a rule as implying that, prior to each step, the rule follower must already have grasped an item of intentional content. Say the instruction, add 2 to the previous number, or the formula y equals 2n, from which she can infer that she should write 1002 after 1000. In the basic cases of rule following on which Wittgenstein focuses, no prior grasp of intentional content is required, and no inference is needed. Now, if we want to take the talk of following and being guided literally, and we seek for something that is followed or which guides us, the best candidate is not a general rule, but rather the particular set of examples we're given. For example, the sequence of numbers 2, 4, 6, 8. Following a rule, in this basic sense, is essentially following examples. And I think that when Wittgenstein talks about following a rule, what he has in mind for the rule is often the set of examples. So this makes sense, for example, of the idea that the aberrant pupil might be following the rule wrongly. That is to say, he's following the examples wrongly. This is a use of the word rule, which goes back to the original sense of a rule as a concrete object, which I mentioned in the first lecture. The word rule from the Latin regula originally applied to measuring sticks, just as the original norm, or norma, was a carpenter's square. Such a rule or norm can guide us, for example, when we use it to determine where to cut the wood. But it doesn't guide us in the way that we're guided by a verbal instruction or a recipe, which we first have to understand. And it's the second type of guidance, the idea of guidance by a general intentional content, that Wittgenstein wants to deny is necessary for rule following. This conception of rule following as going on in a way that involves the primitive consciousness of normativity contrasts with the conception of rule following that Paul Boghossian proposes as capturing our intuitive understanding of following a rule at the personal level, as opposed to subpersonal rule following. This conception has come to be referred to as the ACCER model, where ACCER is an acronym for acceptance, correctness, explanation, and rationalization, and I've put Paul's summary of the model on the handout just for reference. Paul's starting point in developing this model is the idea of a rule as the content of a conditional imperative of the form, if condition C holds, do action A. The example he uses is of the rule, answer any email that calls for an answer immediately upon receipt. And his account also allows for rules conceived as the content of normative propositions, such as if the configuration is C, then castling is permitted. But I'm going to follow him in focusing on the imperative case. Following the rule involves accepting this content, which is most naturally understood as having a corresponding intention. And it involves drawing an inference from that content. On the basis of the content, one can reason from the premise, this is an email that calls for an answer, to the conclusion, answer the email. According to Paul, this generates a problematic regress which undermines the possibility of rule following, making the inference is itself an instance of rule following, specifically following the rule modus ponens, and that in turn requires a further inference. So it looks as though in order to follow any rule, we have to follow another rule, and so on ad infinitum. And this is an important problem and one that I'd be very interested in discussing. But for now, what I'm interested in is not so much the problem, but in the conception of rule following that generates it. Now, I do think that much of our rule following is indeed of the kind captured by the ACCER model, in that it involves explicitly entertaining a general rule in the form of an imperative or a normative proposition, and inferring that one ought to, or is permitted to, perform a particular action. And just to make a connection with the first lecture, I think that this is the kind of rule following on the ACCER model, which is associated with the idea of formal in contrast to substantive normativity. If the conclusion arrived at, that's all I want to say about that. But on Wittgenstein's view, which I think is the right view, this isn't the only kind of rule following which answers to our intuitive conception of what it is to follow a rule. And nor is it the most basic kind of rule following, in the sense of being the kind from which we first learn what it is to follow a rule. The original paradigm of rule following, what we might show someone to get them to see what it is to follow a rule, is the kind of activity we've been looking at in the context of children's language learning. We initially get the idea of rule following as children, not by considering complex cases like that of the email rule, but rather by being exposed to and participating in more primitive cases like continuing patterns of dots and dashes or numerical series, or for that matter, imitating an adult, clapping our hands. we become both to be able to follow rules and to know what rule following is, so to speak, from the bottom up rather than from the top down. It's indeed true that much of our rule following, like the kind illustrated by the email rule, is best captured by a top-down model like the Acker model, but we're capable of engaging in and of grasping the concept of rule following of that kind only because we're able to grasp and follow rules from the bottom up by knowing how to go on. Final section, natural schmatters. I've been arguing that Wittgenstein is committed to the possibility of primitive normativity and that he implicitly relies on the idea of primitive normativity in order to address the problem about rule following suggested by the case of the aberrant pupil. But it might still seem that the problem hasn't been sufficiently addressed. So a very quick way to put Wittgenstein's answer to the rule following problem, as I've been understanding it, is that there has to be a primitively correct way of continuing a sequence like 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on, if we are to be capable of grasping general rules. And that if we can't grasp general rules, then we can't make sense of the choice among interpretations in terms of which the problem of rule following is framed. So the idea is it's that choice among interpretations that seems to generate the problem. We can't even get into this situation where we're wondering which rule the sequence exemplifies unless we are already capable of grasping rules, something like that. However, it might seem that we can generate the problem without having to consider the possibility of alternative interpretations of the sequence, that is, alternative rules that the sequence might exemplify. Perhaps all that's needed is the possibility of disagreement about particular cases of going on. Say, between people like us, who naturally take 1002 to be the correct next step, and people like the aberrant pupil, who naturally take 1004 to be the correct next step. In the face of this possibility, it might seem, we can't simply insist that 1002 is correct and 1004 is not, for it seems clear that from the point of view of the natural schmatters, as I'll call them, I think I probably never said this, but I'm thinking of the alternative rule as the Schmadtu rule. From the point of view of the natural schmatters, their way of going on, that is, they're writing 1004 after 1000, is correct, and ours is mistaken. If we can't give a reason why 1002 is correct, a reason that could in principle convince the natural schmatters that they could change their ways, then it seems our claim is illegitimate. Now, I think we have to allow that there could be creatures who, shown the same kind of examples as we've been shown and given the same kind of encouragement, did react in ways that we would naturally describe as going on differently. So we could imagine that there were creatures such that, shown progressive sequences of dots increasing one at a time, they would react by adding 2 dots each time. Or we could imagine creatures who, given a scrambled array of 4 dolls and 4 boats, would persistently react by spatially putting together 3 dolls and a boat and 3 boats and a doll. And if they got to the point of being able to write numbers in the decimal system and sequences of even numbers, they would follow 1000 with 1004 and then 1008 and resist all attempts to get them to do it differently. And they might also show all the signs of taking a normative attitude to what they were doing. They might make sounds and gestures of protest if we crossed out what they'd written or rearranged the dolls and boats. And we might go so far as to allow that they genuinely did take a normative attitude to what they were doing. But, and I don't actually mean this as a rhetorical question, it's a genuine question, why should that possibility lead us to think that our way of going on or our way of sorting might not be the right way? Why shouldn't we instead think that these people are going on wrong? Or that what they do doesn't count as going on or sorting at all? That is, why shouldn't we allow that they are indeed reacting to being shown the examples of patterns or sequences or being given the boats and dolls to arrange, but that their natural way of reaction isn't to follow the examples or sort the boats and dolls, but simply to do something different? Now, many philosophers think that the possibility of such creatures, let's focus on the natural schmatters, does pose a challenge to the legitimacy of our own claims to be going on correctly. And I think this is because we attempted to imagine the natural schmadders, despite their schmadding behavior, as very much like ourselves, in certain respects at least. That is, we're tempted to imagine them having a language, grasping concepts, adopting rules, and giving reasons for what they're doing. The difference, we think, is just that they have different concepts. They have schmad, and maybe they also have schmegular, schmuniform, and schmame. And correspondingly, we think, they mean something different by their words. They adhere to different rules in their behavior, and they offer different reasons. So we think of their possible existence as raising a question for us. How are we to defend the legitimacy of our concepts and ways of going on against the claim that we imagine them making, that they are the ones going on correctly and that we are the ones going wrong? That is, we imagine ourselves in disagreement with them about whether to write 1002 or 1004 after getting to 1000. And we think that if we can't give a reason why writing 1002 is somehow preferable to writing 1004, a reason that they could in principle accept, then we're not entitled to take writing 1002 to be correct. We might seek such a reason by arguing that add2 is somehow a better concept than schmad2, perhaps because it's simpler, or following David Lewis, perhaps because it's more natural. But that turns out to be ineffective, because we can imagine the schmadders responding that schmad2 is more schmatral or more schmental, and that what they care about is doing the schmatral thing or the schmental thing. But I think that what we're trying to imagine here is incoherent. That is, we can't both imagine these creatures as having the natural inclinations that they do have, and as being capable of any kind of language or thinking, beyond perhaps the bare thought accompanying their behavior that what they do is appropriate. For to imagine them as natural schmadders is in effect to imagine them as creatures who don't know how to go on from examples, or who, otherwise put, lack the capacities for imitation and categorization that, as we saw in the last lecture, are required for language acquisition and grasp of concepts. What we're imagining is not creatures who have different concepts and follow different rules, but creatures who don't have concepts or follow rules at all. So we can't consistently imagine them as having the kinds of conceptual and linguistic abilities that would allow us to make sense of our having a disagreement with them, in which we might offer competing reasons for our different ways of going on. And I know we're past time, but I have just one paragraph. This treatment of the scenario of the natural schmadders is supported by the thought, which I discussed at the end of the last section, that the original paradigm of rule following, the paradigm from which we first come to understand what it is to follow a rule, is given by the activities of continuing sequences and patterns that Wittgenstein describes as part of what's required for language learning. Our concept of what it is to follow a rule is derived, at least initially, from these kinds of examples of what I called going on. In the same way that grasping the concept doll is knowing how to go on from paradigm examples of dolls, so grasping the concept following a rule is knowing how to go on from paradigm examples of rule following. That is, we count something as a case of rule following if we think of it as belonging with the cases of rule following that we've already encountered. But I'm suggesting that the case of someone who consistently responds to being shown the sequence of even numbers up to 1,000 by writing 1004, 1008, that case doesn't belong with paradigm cases of rule following. Such a person is not doing what we call continuing the sequence, or following the examples she's been shown. At best, we might think of her as continuing the sequence, but continuing it wrongly. But what I want to insist that we can't say of her is that she's following the wrong rule. Either we can think of what she's doing as a borderline case of following the add2 rule, in which she consistently does it wrong, or, and this seems to me to be the most natural approach, we can think of her as not following rules at all. And either way, we can't think of her as capable of acquiring a language and grasping concepts. And so I would have liked to end with a snappy conclusion, but I didn't have time to write one. And I'm out of time anyway, so.
Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break. Please put your hand up and keep it up until I acknowledge you. Okay. Oh, so let's see.
Paul, I think you should call on yourself since she specifically mentioned you.
Let me start with Rose. And then I'll come back. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. Thanks very much for the series of lectures. I really enjoyed them. This is maybe a bit cheeky because it's a question really about the second lecture, but it's
That's
related
fine.
to this one because I wonder if it's something that Wittgenstein would say. So I think I'm not understanding how primitive normativity is something that we see on display in the adult's behavior. So if I understood you correctly, there are two sorts of examples that you're interested in whereby a word is applied, a word like doll is applied to an object that it hasn't been applied to before. And in one case, it's kind of just straightforward. It's not a doll that you've seen before, but it very obviously is a doll, and so you call it a doll. And then in the other case, it's really unlike any doll that you've seen before, and so maybe there's a kind of question of whether the word applies, and that seems to be the example you're giving us with the chairs and sofas. And I guess I wasn't, and I may have just misunderstood what you were saying here, but I wasn't able to see why either of these were instances of primitive normativity in your set. So it seemed like in the first case, well, I just apply the word doll, or if I'm interested in characterizing this object as the object that it is, and I say the word doll, there's a reason why I do that, which is that I know the meaning of the word doll, or that given what doll means, one ought to call this a doll. And then in the second case, which resembles the case that Wittgenstein gives us, right, where he has the example of chair-looking object which keeps going in and out of existence. And I think his point there, as I read him anyway, is that this is a case where we have to make a decision. Like our concept doesn't dictate what we should say in this situation. And his point is that that's okay.
Yeah.
The concept was all right, and so we make a decision. And so then it's not clear that that's a normative thing at all. Sorry, that was long, but yes.
Yeah, no, great. So starting with the second part, I don't actually see Wittgenstein's example of the chair going in and out of existence as being like the example that I wanted to give with the artist's mannequin. And that's because I actually do think that it's, I think there's like a real doubt about what you would say. But I have a very strong intuition that the artist's mannequin isn't a doll. And so I actually do see that as a case of a mistake. And I see it as the kind of mistake that that Bert makes about arthritis or contract, sofa, brisket, those kinds of mistakes, where I think it is clear what the right way to go on is, but we can also imagine people getting it wrong while still not going to the extreme of being schmatters. And they're not going to the extreme of being schmatters because they can recognize the mistake when you point it out. So you can point out features of the situation and they'll say, oh, I was wrong, which isn't what the schmatters do. So I don't think of it as, sorry, that's more than I should have said. But basically, I don't think that that's the same kind of case. So taking that away, though, I do agree there are straightforward cases that it's very hard to imagine anybody getting confused about, like, or going wrong, like it's like, you know, it's a Barbie doll. And then there are cases where it's possible to imagine somebody making a mistake, which is what I was trading on. I still think that there's primitive normativity in both of these cases. So you said that in the case where it's straightforward, so it's a Barbie doll. And I say it's a doll, and I'll say, well, that's the right thing to say, given what the word doll means. But I think when we unpack that phrase, given what the word doll means, when we really try to unpack it, we have to unpack it as something like, given how the word doll has been used in the past. That's the point about the primacy of examples. So we think, or we're tempted to think, that knowing what doll means is, like something like having in mind the infinite set of possible dolls, and it's clear that a Barbie doll belongs to that set. But we don't have that. We only have the examples we've been given to go on. So I think even in the straightforward case, there's actually primitive normativity, because our knowledge of what the word means depends on being able to recognize the correctness of what we say in the light of how the word was used in the past.
Lauren.
I think my question is just a version of Rose's, which is that I feel like I've lost a grip on what primitive normativity was at this point. Precisely because it seems like you could respond to the examples like you gave of 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 12, 16, 20, just by saying like, that next one isn't in the sequence, or something like that, or isn't in the sequence that was being captured. And I think I'm just losing a track of where the ought is that isn't relative to. Because if I understand primitive normativity right, it's supposed to be oughts that aren't relative to rules.
Right.
So I'm just,
Yes. Well, I mean, I do think it's kind of elusive, but the way that I try to keep it in focus is by thinking about the under twos. And so whatever normativity they recognize when they're sorting things, and they see one thing as belonging with other things, that's kind of, I want to say, that's what I mean by primitive normativity. Go ahead.
is it normativity because it's driving behavior in some sense? Because you could see them as thinking like, oh, that one is like the others.
Well,
that one ought to or belongs.
Right. So that's kind of a question about why am I saying that it's normativity as opposed to why am I saying that it's primitive. But let me just talk about the alternative you gave. So rather than thinking, you're having the child think, not this ought to go here, but this is similar to that. But first, the concept similar is, I think it's more sophisticated than the concept ought. I think, like Wittgenstein suggests in section 208 of the investigations, you learn the use of a word like similar by being given examples of similarity, and you have to know how to go on from those examples. So I think the thought this is similar to that is more sophisticated and harder for a 2-year-old than the thought this ought to go here. And second, even if we grant that the under 2 does have the thought, this is similar to that, we still have to explain why the child thinks that she ought to put, or why the child is motivated to put the similar things together. So there's kind of have to be a step from the appreciation of similarity to the actual action or the recognition of the action as what ought to be done.
Got a finger, Michael?
Yeah. Okay. So this is connected to a question I asked last time about whether we can have mistakes without primitive normativity. So it seems that the kinds of concerns Lauren is raising connect to the idea that children can do these things, they can try to be doing something, they can sometimes fail to do them, they can think of what they're doing when they fail as making a mistake, without them having to actually conceive of there being an ought that's governing the activity. So they intend to continue to produce a certain sequence, or they intend to put together the things that belong together, or they intend to apply a word to the class of things that the word refers to. Sometimes they fail. That's a mistake. But it doesn't that doesn't require that they be thinking of what they're doing in terms of of normativity, that they ought to be putting together things that are similar, that they ought to be producing that particular sequence or using the word in a certain way.
Right. So I find it very hard to separate the idea of mistake and the idea of normativity. So for me, kind of almost by definition, they are just in the same world. That might be because I'm thinking of normativity in this like very broad traditional sense. But correct and mistaken would be paradigms of normativity in the way that I'm thinking about normativity. And to the point about the children intending to put the things together, or the things together that belong together, I really want to avoid trying to ascribe intentions like that to the children, because I'm always thinking, that's too sophisticated. All I want is this like very primitive thing that the kid picks up the doll, and they don't even have to like think. It's just like, this here ought.
But surely children act intentionally, even if they're not kind of thinking in terms of sophisticated agential notions.
Yeah. Well, I think from a very early age they act purposively. So a 3-month-old who has figured out that pulling the cord is going to make the rattle sound, they do that, I think, purposively. So I don't want to deny that children can behave purposively, and that you can say, this is an example from Piaget. Piaget says, actually talking about his son, realizing that the harder he pulls, the louder the sound is. Piaget says, it's impossible not to think of Laurent as acting intentionally. So I think I do want to say that, but then I think I want to avoid saying that Laurent has an intention with the following content.
Well, never mind that, but let's suppose they go to pool, they want a nice loud sound, and they go to pool, but they mess it up and they don't get a sound. They fail in their intentional behavior, they've made a mistake, but they don't see an ought in it.
Well, no, I don't either, because I don't think there's normativity yet in that picture of just pulling the cord.
And then all the rest of us are like that.
Well, I don't know if we should, I mean, you might have a good point there. I hope we can pursue it later.
Patrick.
So I think it's in the same vein. When you try to explicate this, there is no reason comments from Wittgenstein, you said that in the primary or most fundamental level, you're thinking that there's this substratum of oughts.
Yeah.
And that's the most basic thing, and so reasons can't be more primitive than primitive normativity. They have to be higher up in the hierarchy. And I guess I was thinking, often a reason, or some evidence for thinking that below the layer of oughts, we have an additional layer of reasons, comes from judgments that, although in some cases it might be that we ought to do something, there are different considerations that pull us in different directions, and that bear on that ought. And so I'm wondering whether you think something like that happens in these cases of putatively primitive normativity. So I had a quick Google during the break, and apparently there are 2 famous mathematical sequences that begin 1, 1, 2, 3, 5.
Yeah.
And you might think, so of course there's the Fibonacci sequence, there's also this other like partition sequence.
Yes.
Okay. And you might think that like maybe they correspond to different kinds of aesthetic value or something in mathematics, and so you might think the choice between these is a matter of like weighing, considerations, and those determine what ought to be the continuation of that sequence. And that seems like kind of a piece with the maybe standard arguments elsewhere in ethics for thinking that below the layer of like, you morally ought to do something, there are these little constituents called reasons that push and pull us in different directions.
Yes.
So I was wondering what if you felt that had force as an argument for there being primitive reasons below primitive normativity.
Right. Well, I don't think there are primitive reasons below primitive normativity, but let me try to explain why I think these considerations are really interesting, but let me explain why I'm not moved by them. The first, I wonder if when you originally said there is you characterized my view very clearly about the substrata and the levels, but then when you said there are different considerations that bear on what one ought to do, I was thinking, well, that sounds as though you're using the term ought in the kind of Korsgaardian sense, and not in the very neutral sense that I'm thinking of it. So that was my first thought. So I agree that the kind of sense of ought that Korsgaard is interested in, you decide what you ought to do by considering what the balance of reasons is. But then I'm thinking there's levels of ought. There's the sort of ought, the kind of practical ought, which is based on reasons, but I'm trying to identify this bottom layer of ought that has nothing below it, not even reasons. Then you talked about how that 1, 1, 2, 3, 5 is not just the Fibonacci sequence, but can be lots of other sequences. And there's I don't know that example, but I mean, this, for example, is, I refer everybody to this wonderful website, the Online Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences, and you can type in any sequence of integers, including the one that just really had me stumped. But you would, of course, know what it is. There's the sequence that begins, I'm not going to be able to reproduce it, but it has 14 and 23, and help me out, actually, it's the sequence of the number 1 or the A subway line in New York. You will also find that in the Online Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences. I'm sorry, that was a distraction. But I think that, yeah, we can, this was sort of what I was trying to illustrate with this example. We can come up with examples where we say, oh, this finite sequence can be interpreted according to this complex mathematical rule or this complex mathematical rule. But I'm impressed by the fact that we can do that. We can get into this position of comparing different possible interpretations and different possible rules only because we understand the expressions that go into those rules. So we understand what the Fibonacci sequence is, and we understand the Fibonacci sequence because we have the idea of adding two numbers, and then you put the third number, and then you take the two numbers, the last two numbers you wrote, and then you add those, and then you put another number. And the reason that we wouldn't be able to do that, we wouldn't be able to understand plus unless we were able to go on this primitive way, which is the substratum. So it's almost like it's self-defeating to try to undermine the substratum by saying, well, but it could be interpreted in different ways, because the possibility of interpreting it in different ways depends on being able to conceive of the different ways, which depends on knowing how to go on from the examples in ways where there isn't any ambiguity.
Sharon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah, for the whole series of lectures. And I wanted to follow up in a way on what we were talking about last time about your thought that there are fundamentally privileged ways of sorting. And so I was very interested in the last section on the natural schmatters.
Yeah.
And wanted to speak up on their behalf. So I like if it's focusing on the doll boat example, I think is the most helpful. And so one thing just about the example you give about dolls and boats in groups of 3 dolls in a boat and 3 boats in a doll, that's kind of strange way because it implies that they're already doing the doll boat sorting and then they're doing this other thing about 3 and 1. So I find it helpful just to think, well, they're sorting it according to color or weight or whether it has traces of mercury or not.
Yes, that will do, yes.
Yeah, so the idea that the doll boat way of sorting these objects is fundamentally privileged, does seem implausible to me. Like I said last time, to me it seems that we can imagine creatures who sort those 8 objects in very, very different ways, but it's because, say on the planet they come from, Mercury, it's really important to stay away from it or something like that.
Yes.
And so, and they've got a value system such that these other ways of sorting are the ones that are right according to their value system, is one way of putting it. So I wanted to ask, in a way, to me there's this anti-realist option available here that in a way is sort of overlooked by these sentences on the handout. Because so I'm imagining these kind of coherent different sorters.
Yes.
And then you say, but why should that lead us to think that our way of going on might not be the right way? And I want to say is, no, you're right, it shouldn't. We can imagine that their way is right for them and our way is right for us, given the kind of creatures we are. Doll boat kind of sorting makes sense. But given the kind of creature they are, traces of mercury not makes sense.
Right.
And so you don't need to say that they're going wrong. You can recognize them as clearly sorting. They are following a rule. But you also don't need to say that we might not be right either. There's kind of this other option that I think should be on the table that's more plausible metaphysically than saying that there's sort of something fundamentally privileged about the boat doll sorting.
Right. So I'm going to begin with the idea of right for them versus right for us. I have a problem with that. It's difficult for me to articulate it, but so the problem is something like this. When, for example, a child thinks that the doll should go here, or we should say doll about this, and she has a conviction that she is doing it right, the conviction never gets unpacked for her as this is right for human beings. She doesn't have the concept of human being yet. Her conviction is this is right simplicator. This is just right. And I don't know if I can spell out the argument, but I sort of have a conviction that if we can't give her this and ourselves, this idea of right simplicator, and not like right for human beings, then we can't think of meanings and concepts of things that we actually grasp. So I think the idea of knowledge of meaning goes out the window. But I don't know that I'm actually able to reconstruct that argument. It's just something that I've thought about right for them and right for us. Now, I really like your idea of the people on other planets sorting according to these different criteria. But you've described ways, and I probably should think more about that kind of alternative way of sorting, and not the bizarre way in which the aberrant pupil goes on. But when I think about those sorts of alternative ways of sorting, I then think the question would be, suppose we get them to come here. Could they get the idea? I mean, the thing is, we can get the idea of their way of sorting. They can explain it to us. We can make sense of it. We may not be able to detect the traces of mercury, but once we know about it, then we can then we can sort their way. So I don't think their way of sorting is really incommensurable with ours, and I might allow that they have concepts and all of that. Wittgenstein does as well when he allows that there could be like different basic series. There are passages where he seems to allow that. When I'm interested in, the schmatters that I'm thinking about do something that's just completely incomprehensible to us, and they never could. And the really important thing is, can they get our way of sorting? Could they be brought to get our way of sorting? And if they could never be brought to get it, then I want to stick to my guns and say, they don't know how to go on from examples.
Speak up. Oh, did you?
Just going to supersede my hand.
Yeah.
Right, just suppose that you in response to Sharon, go, just suppose that they can grok our way, and there's like, oh, you guys don't need to care about Mercury, I can see what, it's all fine. And it says that you're willing to say that they have concepts and do all that thing. So that but then there's still the question, well, is it still, are they wrong when they, so on your view then, they are thinking the primitive normative thought when they put the Mercury ones in one group and the no mercury
Yeah.
in a different group, they're thinking some thought like, I ought to, in the primitive normative sense,
Yeah.
put these ones over here
Yeah.
with these ones together. So earlier, in the last section of the talk, you gave us this kind of dilemma. Like, I did this, imagine some creatures. I did, they don't have concepts at all, or they're getting it wrong.
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to develop this thing in such a way that you're not going to go for they don't have concepts at all.
Yes.
Part of the dilemma. So that seems to leave you, given the way you set things up in the paper, with having to say that weirdly, growing up on a planet with Mercury makes you go wrong about this topic of primitive normativity. It seems kind of
So
impossible.
when I was thinking about the Schmaders, I wasn't thinking about this kind of case. So, I think this is an important kind of case, and what I'm realizing is I do need to think about it, like intelligible alternative ways of sorting that we can actually make sense of. And so I might be willing, but I wonder what happens if I do that, but I might be willing to say that that they're right, that this is primitive normativity for them, and then what primitive normativity for us is for them the kind of normativity that you get in accordance with a criterion.
So this is invoking this extra sort of argument place, the relative, doing the thing where it's like the for us, for them thing that you said that you were uncomfortable with in response to Sharon. On the grounds that people they don't even have the concept of us or human being or whatever.
No, I don't. So I don't think it's the same thing as that.
Oh, okay.
But I need to think about this. I don't think it's the same thing as that because I'm suggesting that the people who sort by the traces of Mercury, and for them, sort of like, so kind of subpersonally, that's the most salient thing. That's their mechanism. And for them, what's primitive, and there's no argument place, for them what's primitive is what they well, I'm going back and forth because here's a possibility. So there might be a third way. I really feel like I'm on the spot here, which is great. Thank you. But here's a third possibility. It could be that, okay, let's take the series. It's a peculiar fact about arithmetical series, an unusual fact, that there's actually only ever one. And then let me scratch that. So there are cases where, if I can give a child an ambiguous set of objects. So let's say there are animals of two different kinds and colors of two different kinds. And there genuinely are two different ways in which those could be primitively sorted. So just because, so one child might think that it's primitively correct to add a new blue thing to the pile of blue things. A second child might think that it's correct to put a hedgehog with the other hedgehogs. So in this case, there are multiple ways in which one could take something to be primitively correct without criteria. So I think this is maybe what I would want to say about these alternative people who are sensitive to traces of Mercury. It's like they're not wrong, but then in a way, nor would one of our people be wrong. It might just be, so there could be some perfectly ordinary human child on our planet who peculiarly was just super sensitive to traces of Mercury. And so this would kind of like blot out for her the difference between the dolls and the boats, and so she would sort together the things that had the traces of Mercury. And I want to say, no, she wouldn't be wrong doing that. So maybe I can allow multiple ways of, like, unrelativized, okay, primitive normativity without criteria.
Then it seems though that great, but then it seems that the truth about primitive normativity is that there's multiple permissible things one can do. Not everything is permissible, but there's some bunch of but if the child is thinking, I ought to do this,
Yeah.
then the child is wrong. If I ought means this is the only, because ought,
Yeah.
I take it means this is the only
No,
permissible thing.
well, this is really helpful because
Okay.
I'm not thinking of ought in this deontic way.
Okay.
So really what I should say is that the child thinks that this is appropriate. So you can think of multiple things. You can think this is the appropriate thing to do. This fits.
One of the appropriate things.
Yes, but there
Yeah.
could be a choice. There could be a choice of appropriate things.
Thanks.
Dave. Yeah. This
Oh,
is,
yeah. Oh, me.
Sorry, no, Dave. There was a follow-up.
Yeah, this is exactly what I wanted to ask about. Because you said that the schmatters, people don't know how to go on. But, we can schmat. We can learn to schmat. We went to the schmatters planet. Before long, we at least learned to simulate them and it'd be more complex for them. But for us, after a while, we shouldn't have the concept of schmadition, as indeed we do. Likewise, it seems they could, if they visited us, they could at least learn to simulate us and do these things, at the very least non-primitively at first, learn to add. I'm imagining after a while there could be a nice little detente. We'd all have a dual conceptual scheme. There'd be addition and there'd be schmadition, and we'd find addition more natural, and they'd find schmadition more natural. But we'd learn how to talk to each other. And then the question is, what really would we disagree about? I mean, substantively. I mean, I certainly see that we disagree substantively about certain applications, like say induction. Adding, our scheme is much better for doing induction than yours. But where it actually comes to the concept or the meaning part, I don't really see why we shouldn't just lapse into a very friendly detente. But there are just two different ways of going on, and we like this way and you like this way. And I think this kind of goes along with the thing you said at the very end, which is that the relevant normativity here is not the kind that goes along with authority. You don't have to go on one way or the other. It's the kind of normativity that goes along with guidance. Here's a way of going on, here's another way of going on, given that way you ought to, but it's not, once you reject it as the normativity of authority, I don't see why we shouldn't have a more relaxed pluralism here.
So I want to disagree with the bit at the very beginning because I don't think we ever could. I don't think schmatting ever could come naturally to us. And it's just to bring this out, it's so extreme when we're dealing with the schmatter. Oh, I can't make it close. And so when we're dealing with the schmatter, we get to a point. So they've written 1004, 1008. And we say, no, you should have written 1002. And then we say, look, you wrote 10. And then you wrote 12, and then you wrote 100, and then you wrote 102. Look, each time you wrote a 0, and then a 2, and then, I'm sorry if this is like superfluous, but it's just the kind of consideration that really impresses me. You point to this and you say, but can't you see you're doing something different here? And the schmatter that I'm imagining is totally uncomprehending because they say, no, when it's over here, it's the same as here. So they're sort of, you put them, then you start like doing experiments. You write 2 and 4 in different places on the board, and well, are they the same here? Are they the same here? It's like, so I'm imagining when it kind of gets down to brass tacks, it's just, they are completely incomprehensible. And in terms of coming to a détente with them, if we can imagine them at all, which I never like, for the sake of argument, I'll follow you and try to imagine that they are people that we can interact with. When it comes to trying to get a détente with them, for all we know, after we have smiled and shaken hands with them, like 500 times, the 501st time when we extend our hand, they will bite it. There's just no interacting with these. There would be no interacting with these.
I guess I'm thinking there could be an algorithm the Schmatters are following. If we could come to understand that as an algorithm, it might be a very different kind of algorithm from the ones that we follow. But once we understood that algorithm, then we would actually be able
Well, suppose
to
we do, though,
predict their
understand that
behavior.
they do, like, things are not the same for them after 500 times, then that really does raise the worry about we're going to do all these things 500 times and then they'll suddenly start reacting differently. The other thing I just want to say, this is partly reacting to Sharon saying she wants to defend the Schmatters. I mean, it can seem terribly, I feel like it can seem very kind of elitist and arrogant to me to be saying, oh, our way of doing it is right, and these others, they're just wrong. But I feel like we have to keep reminding ourselves, the Schmatters don't exist, they're fictions of figments of our imagination. We made them up. And I'm suggesting that that imagining is sort of incoherent because we're imagining them being different from us in this so hugely radical way.
I see a Netflix miniseries coming out.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, this discussion runs very naturally with what I wanted to ask, which is the role of intentionality in the views to which you're opposed. And there's two issues on which I'd like you to comment. One is whether there's a proper role for the notion of seeing this example, or this set of examples, or this initial segment of a series, seeing it as grouped in a certain way, whether that can be an explanatory notion. It seems to me as soon as you allow that to be an explanatory notion, that can make it rational to go on one way rather than another, because the seeing as doesn't just apply just to these particular examples, it unifies them under a concept, something intentional. Second thing, you're really going to hate this, but let me say it. Knowing how to go on is a special case of knowing how. And if you're interested in the general thesis that knowing how is to be explained in terms of knowing that, then knowing, for an arbitrary example, how to go on should plausibly be explained in terms of knowing that the correct way to go on is it's the one meeting condition C, intentional content.
Yes.
Which is the grouping which you initially saw. And that's much more plausible, I think, than just thinking somebody's grasped a list of cases or then grabbed one of things. So maybe you'd like to comment on those issues.
Yeah, well, about the second, I think I am unsympathetic to the idea that knowing how is a form of knowing that. I feel like the way that I'm thinking of Stanley and Williamson, and I'm not going to try to reproduce, I'm not sure if I can even remember why I wasn't convinced by that line of argument, but some of it had to do with reliance on data from linguistics, which seems sort of as dubious to me as philosophers' reliance on their own intuitions somehow is. But that is possibly an ad hominem point. Maybe I will just say, sorry, oh dear, now I feel like oh, this is going to be on YouTube. Oh dear. Apologies for my, to anyone watching this, for my incautiousness and the sort of being off the cuff. But I guess I'll just leave it at that about knowing how being a form of knowing that.
The first issue.
Yes, but on the first issue. So I'm trying to think in cases like the ones that I'm interested in. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we see things like series or we see objects as grouped in a certain way. I think I would be inclined to think of the notion of seeing as in terms of recognizing what ought to go with what, rather than the other way around. So I think I might be inclined to take the notion of primitive normativity as more basic than the notion of seeing as. So one of the things that I'm thinking of in this connection is this example of Wittgenstein's of a duck-rabbit figure. And in a field of ducks, I think, and in a field of rabbits, and maybe I'm not remembering this example right, but it seems to me that seeing it as a duck might be understood as seeing it as belonging with the duck pictures, with the unambiguous duck pictures, and seeing it as a rabbit would be a matter of seeing it as belonging with the unambiguous rabbit pictures, so that we would make out what it is to see something as F by seeing it as, by thinking that we're thinking of it as to be sorted with the Fs, the other Fs. So similarly, like seeing a pattern in terms of groups, it seems natural to me to think of that seeing as a matter of being inclined to, or finding it natural to, sort it one way rather than another. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's that, I think you wanted seeing as to be kind of explanatory, and I want to say, no, actually it's the other way around. Seeing as is explained in terms of primitive normative sorting.
Anya.
Yeah, I think this goes back to something that I asked you before over dinner, and then what I expect to the discussion people were having at the beginning, trying to really understand what primitive normativity is supposed to mean. So the people at the beginning were worried that what we end up with is maybe not really normativity anymore, and I'm now worried about the primitiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So the primitiveness was supposed to be that it's normativity that is not relative to reasons or rules. At least that's what it was presented as in the first lecture.
Yes.
And then in the second lecture, it started to sort of transpire that maybe there are rules after all.
Yes.
But you said at that point these are subpersonal. And now it transpires even more clearly that definitely there are rules. But maybe they're not even subpersonal, because as we say here, the person who knows how to go on grasps a rule.
Yes.
So it's really at the personal level that
Yes.
the grasping of the rule is actually happening.
Yes.
So there is a rule that's in play at the personal level that really sets up the whole normativity thing. So I don't understand anymore how this is really primitive.
Yes.
So maybe just a suggestion. I mean, I think for me it would have been helpful if the framing hadn't been in terms of primitive versus non-primitive, or rule governed versus non-rule governed, but rather directly as just a question of what do we understand when we say that we follow a rule or that we grasp a rule.
Yep.
Because as you helpfully also pointed out, the target is really, well, guys like follow. Who have this view that rule following involves this, the Acer model, and that grasping a rule requires, explicit presentation of the thing in general terms. And so I think that is really where the meat of the debate actually is. And so maybe that, for me, would have been more helpful to really put clear that, that's where the disagreement is.
Well, first of all, thank you for the suggestion at the end. I want to respond first to your having said, so you described three things I said about primitive normativity. I began in the first lecture by saying that it's not relative to reasons or rules. Then you said in the second, then you said it transpired that there are rules at the subpersonal level. I don't think that is actually something that I wanted to say, but it doesn't matter, because it's superseded by the third thing. Definitely there are rules, not even subpersonal. A person who knows how to go on grasps a rule. And then you said, verbatim if I got it down right, there is a rule in play that sets up the whole normativity thing. Now, I agree that there's a rule in play, but I don't want to say that it's the rules being in play that sets up the whole normativity thing. I want to say that there is a rule in play, but there's a rule in play only because we first have the normativity thing in place. So the rule isn't playing any kind of explanatory role in explaining or grounding the normativity. And there's just one thing that I wanted to say more about how I originally introduced the notion of primitive normativity. I didn't actually introduce it, I don't think, although I may have been sloppy in how I went on, but I didn't mean to introduce it as primitive in the sense of not being relative to rules or grounded in reasons. I said it was primitive in two senses. One was that it was a normativity that we needed to recognize in order to, as a condition of grasping rules and concepts and linguistic meanings. So primitive, so to speak, primitive in the sense of being sort of philosophically explanatorily primitive. And then I also said that it was developmentally primitive because it's a normativity that can be recognized at an earlier developmental stage.
Can I say one little thing?
Okay.
All right.
We'll go a little bit over because we started late. And you're on the list, Paul. You're on the list.
So I hear what you're saying, that you definitely want to deny that the direction is rules, therefore normativity, or having the condition of knowing the rule for understanding the normativity. I get that, but I don't see why it's really the other way around, that we have the primitive normativity and that somehow gives us the rule. It seems to me it's just coeval. I mean, what it is to have normativity is to grasp these rules. And so, if rules then can be cashed out as a kind of reason, it is a reason. Normativity is tied to reasons. There's just no way around the reason or the rule. And there's no priority of the normativity to a reason. It's just the same.
Right. No, I mean, that's really helpful to have that on the table, the possibility that these are coeval rather than one being prior to the other. And that's the view, for example, that McDowell has. I don't know how explicit he has, but I mean, it's a view when I've talked to him about this stuff. That's what he thinks. And that's because he rejects the idea that there's any standpoint from which we can step outside to try to explain how we grasp rules and meanings. But I think I have sort of explanatory aspirations. I think that it is possible to explain grasp of rules and meaning. So the reason why I don't want it to be coeval is I actually want to say, here's this thing, the recognition of primitive normativity, that even though it, when you do have somebody who is reliably capable of recognizing primitive normativity, they thereby grasp a rule, there's still a direction of explanation there, because there's the thereby and the in virtue of. On the coeval view, it would have to go both ways. But I want to say that explanation only goes one way.
Well, since my name was mentioned, and my question really follows very directly onto this, if I may, I'll just insert myself quickly here. So it's an explanatory claim, explanatory basicness. The grasp of a concept or the grasp of a rule is to be explained in terms of knowing how to go on correctly or how you ought to go on. And now I have a question about how you're understanding this phrase, knowing how one ought to go on. So there are two possibilities. One of them is that you think of it in dispositional terms. So at every step, the kid has a disposition to go on in a certain way, and that is, in fact, the correct way. The other is that you have some kind of intentional construal of this, a propositional knowledge. That would be knowledge that at every point you're supposed to add to, stated in propositional terms. Now, the second thing, of course, is not useful for explaining how you grasp concepts in the first place. So it's got to be the first thing. But the first thing, as we know from the discussion of Kripke, is that the dispositions are finite. On the other hand, what's being grasped is infinitary. So how exactly are we going to get from knowing how to go on the basis of these finite examples to the grasp of an infinitary content?
Okay. So, I mean, so first of all, I mean, this is a great question. Not surprisingly. But the first, here's what I think Wittgenstein might respond. So he might say, look, Paul, add to is an infinitary notion. But you understand what add to means. how did you ever come to understand, or how do you know what add to means? And then he would say, ultimately, the way that you're able to understand add to is because somebody once showed you this, and you got the idea. Or like take cardinal number, that's maybe a better case. Somebody showed you this, and that's what got you the idea of number. And so I think Wittgenstein would say, or maybe he would say, that he would grant that it's an infinitary notion. I think, in spite of his tendency towards mathematical intuitionism and constructivism, maybe well reverse. It's like what I think he could say. But I still think he could say, I mean, I think we can say we in fact do understand these infinitary expressions like cardinal number because we get the hang of sequences like this. Now there's the objection, though, that how are we to make sense of this knowledge of how we ought to go on? And the way you put it was that one option you gave me was that intentional, that doesn't, and I agree with you, I don't want that. And the alternative you gave me was, at every step, the kid has a disposition. I don't know if this is relevant, but it seems to me that there's a scope issue here, because I don't want to say that at every step the kid has a disposition, so the disposition is within the scope of at every step. I want to say something like, just generally, the kid has a disposition, and the disposition is such that when given a number, the kid will add 2 to that number. Now, I'm perfectly well aware that there are numbers that are large enough that, in fact, the kid won't do that. The way that I understand dispositions, that still doesn't get in the way of interpreting the child as having a disposition. And that partly has to do with just like how I understand dispositions. So there are all sorts of things that can interfere with a disposition. And one thing that can interfere with it is that the numbers are very, very large. So I still want to say that the kid has a disposition such that, this is the content of the disposition, they're given this number and they produce the number that's that number plus 2. Now, I think that there's a worry like the one that you're talking about. If we somehow suppose that we need to be able to read off we somehow need to be able to read off all the values of the function from a description of the disposition. And I think that Kripke assumes that we've got to be able to do something like that. But I think I don't see why that has to be. So I know there's more to be said on this topic, but that's the first pass.
Reading off, is that a good sequence for you?
Yeah, it's good. So I just so I agree with you. And we're talking about knowing how, which is not the same as knowing that. And knowing how to do something is a skill. So we're talking about skills. And one doesn't always feel that somehow goes with some kind of normativity. I mean, if somebody knows how to stand on their head, they just could do it, and that's it. And I don't know whether there's no normativity as far as I can see there. But take the main example coming from Wittgenstein, that the meaning of a word is supposed to be the way in which it's a way of using the word in the linguistic community. And so let's say somebody has that, knows how to use the word. And it's a kind of habit.
Yes.
Or a tendency, it's thought.
Yes.
And that's okay, that's the way they use it. They know how to use it.
Yeah.
And that's, in some sense, I mean, maybe it counts as the correct tendency because that's the one that everyone else in the community, you know, for communication, you want
Yes.
to speak the same language as everyone else. I mean, in the
Yes.
community,
Yeah.
that's the way, you know, which, so there is that.
Yeah.
So there's that. Is that where the normativity comes in? Just because the normativity, because we want to be able to communicate, so we want to be using the words
Yeah.
in the same way.
We'll have to keep it short, Paul. We have one more question to get to.
Yeah,
So please.
so,
Okay, right, so that's not where the normativity comes in for me. So I do get the idea that there are tendencies, and it's good to do it because otherwise we wouldn't be able to communicate. But that's not where the normativity comes into the picture for me.
yeah.
Now I agree that we can use the word know-how just to talk about a habit, tendency, or disposition. So just by calling this a case of knowing how, I haven't really ruled out that it could be just a capacity, tendency, or disposition, but I do think that if we just think that the use of words is a matter of having a habit, tendency, or disposition, then we can't make sense of the idea that we're capable of knowing what the meaning of a word is. So I think if we want to hang on to our talk of grasping meanings, knowing meanings, we have to not just think of our use of words as a matter of habits, tendencies, or dispositions, but we have to build in this recognition of normativity.
Okay, well, final quick question from Jake.
I was just going to ask about the last section and whether you take yourself to be taking Wittgenstein's line on this, because I had sort of always thought that, and, you know, it's been a while, but
Yeah.
forms of life and
Yeah.
linguistic community play a really important part in his
Yeah.
account of how it is we come to follow a rule, and
Yeah.
you might think that has a sort of relativist
Yeah.
drift to it, and so I was curious whether, you know, do you think that's sort of optional
Yeah.
if one has a position like his, or?
Yeah. It's a great question. I don't know. I am like puzzling over what Wittgenstein's own line is on this. I am leaning towards saying that it's the position that I defend, for obvious reasons. But I think that, I mean, he's very elusive, but he talks about, when he talks about these other possible forms of life that we can imagine, for example, the wood sellers or the people with the rubber rulers, he always provides descriptions of them that make them sound like they could potentially be comprehensible, which would actually make them more like, that would make them more like, I'm thinking of Sharon's question, that would make them more like the people who sort things like in terms of mercury. Like we could potentially communicate with those people, because it turns out that the people with the rubber rulers, maybe they use them to favor some customers rather than others. So I'm inclined to think that I don't see anything that makes me think that he would be committed to saying that the aberrant pupil is, and that's, sorry, I know we're almost out of time, but we are out of time. But just think about in section 145 when he talks about, it's not quoted on the handout, but he imagines a child who, when we try to get them to write the digits and they copy them, they go something like 0, 1, 3, 2, 5, 4. They like persistently get them in the wrong order. And then he says, well, this seems like and he's compared that to just a random mistake. So he said there could be random mistakes or there could be systematic mistakes like this. But then he says that there isn't that they shade into each other. And then he says something like, the pupil's capacity to learn can come to an end here. And he also says, and Verständigung, which is either understanding or communication, is no longer possible at this point. And that, I think, is maybe support for his holding the view that I described.
This has been a terrific and very stimulating series. Thank you so much.